The forest wind moaned like a choir of the damned, carrying with it the whispers of names long forgotten. They were daughters, sisters, brides-to-be who entered the castle walls and never came out. Their bodies, stripped of identity, were dragged beneath the pines or shoveled into mass graves where no prayers were said. Tonight, we walk into that nightmare where beauty and power devoured innocence, and what investigators unearthed beneath the roots of those trees will make your blood run cold. Before we descend, make sure you hit subscribe, because these are the stories that history tried to bury with the bones. In the heart of 17th century Europe, noble families ruled like minor gods. Peasants bowed, priests blessed, and soldiers obeyed. Among these houses stood one lady of terrifying influence, cloaked in velvet and crowned with jewels, yet haunted by a single fear: the fading of her beauty. Her husband's death left her widowed and bitter, and grief soon curdled into obsession. Courtiers whispered of her cruelty, servants dreaded her gaze, and villagers prayed to keep their daughters unseen. But power soon turned her curiosity into a nightmare. The first disappearance was almost too quiet to notice. A farm girl promised work at the castle never returned, and her parents were told she had run away with a lover. Yet in the village tavern, men muttered that they had seen a cart leaving the castle under moonlight, its canvas shifting as though something alive struggled beneath. Days later, wolves howled in the forest, and hunters discovered scraps of cloth tangled in the underbrush, stiff with dried blood. Inside the fortress, chambers once used for storage were transformed into crude laboratories of cruelty. Torches hissed against damp walls, the air thick with the smell of wax and iron. A girl was led inside, trembling, her sobs muffled by cloth pressed against her mouth. Blades flashed, veins were pierced, and basins filled while the mistress waited nearby, her expression calm, almost reverent, as though she presided over a sacred ritual. When it was done, the attendants carried the body away to the forest, where shallow earth swallowed her name forever. The forests grew heavy with secrets. Villagers who wandered too close claimed the soil breathed, that certain clearings reeked of rot even in winter. Dogs refused to pass certain paths, growling at unseen shapes. And when rains came, the earth wept crimson streaks of blood seeping from the ground, as though the graves themselves wanted to speak. Families began to whisper that the land had become cursed, poisoned by the silence of too many buried without candles or crosses. But she did not stop. Each ritual only deepened her hunger. Wagons returned again and again with girls promised work, with servants who never came home, with strangers whose families were too far to ask questions. Their bodies were discarded like broken dolls, some abandoned in ditches, others dumped into pits so wide they became silent cathedrals of the dead. No markers, no prayers, only the suffocating weight of anonymity. The forest became a cemetery without names, and the villagers lived in dread of hearing their daughters' laughter vanish forever. One night, a woodcutter stumbled upon a pit after a storm had split the earth. He fell to his knees when he saw the bones stacked like firewood skulls staring upward as if begging for recognition. He fled, but in the village square his words were drowned by fear. No one wanted to believe, for belief meant action, and action against nobility was suicide. So the silence thickened and the pit was covered again, its occupants abandoned once more to the darkness. The priest of the parish could no longer ignore the confessions pouring into his ears, fathers mourning daughters, mothers clutching rosaries until their fingers bled. He marched to the castle gates with his cross held high, demanding answers. The mistress met him in velvet and jewels, smiling sweetly as though nothing weighed upon her soul. She invited him to dine. Her voice honeyed her eyes cold. And though the priest left unharmed, he confessed to his diary that he had smelled the forest on her skin, the damp perfume of leaves covering rot. The steward of the estate, his face pale as parchment, carried the weight of complicity. His ledgers were filled with initials and symbols, codes marking who had been chosen, who had been discarded, who had been buried nameless in the woods. At night he wept as he wrote his tears, smearing ink into blots, whispering apologies no one would ever hear. He prayed for strength to confess, but every dawn brought only fear and the arrival of yet another wagon. By now, the villagers knew the truth, though they dared not speak it openly. Songs turned into warnings sung to children at dusk, and mothers tied red ribbons around their daughters' wrists as protection. Still, the forest claimed more victims, and silence became its accomplice. One farmer muttered bitterly, "The trees know their names, but we do not." And the words spread like a curse, a reminder that the greatest cruelty was not only death, but to be forgotten, erased, and left to rot, nameless in the soil. The castle's walls seemed to breathe with dread as more girls disappeared into its maw. Villagers watched torches snake up the mountain path at night, wagons covered in canvas creaking under invisible weight. They knew those wagons would return empty, the laughter of daughters replaced by silence that spread through kitchens and hearths like disease. No one dared follow, but every man who glanced at the tree line swore he heard cries woven into the wind. One huntsman, hardened by winters and wolves, ventured near the forest clearing where no birds sang. He stumbled upon shallow graves disturbed by rain, a pale hand reaching through soil as if clawing for air. He ran back, trembling, swearing the forest itself had eyes, that the roots clutched bones, the way veins cling to flesh. His warning was met with silence, for the people feared truth more than they feared ghosts. Inside the fortress, the rituals grew systematic. Basins lined in silver cloths prepared to stifle sound attendants trained to drag bodies swiftly through hidden doors. The mistress treated the chambers as sacred, a cathedral where youth was paid for with blood. When her attendants hesitated, she reminded them of the graves in the forest. "Do you want to join them, nameless? Fear bound them tighter than chains." The priest, restless and burdened, began keeping a secret ledger of his own. He listed each missing girl by name, refusing to let them vanish entirely. Maria Anna Ilona Katerin. His list stretched longer each month, a silent rebellion against the anonymity of mass graves. At night, he prayed over the names as though each syllable could stitch dignity back into their memory, even if their bodies lay faceless beneath leaves. The Countess grew bold, holding banquets where her skin glowed unnaturally, her cheeks flushed with vitality that defied age. Guests whispered in awe, envied her, toasted her. Yet when the fires dimmed, her laughter echoed too loudly, brittle and sharp as glass. A cousin visiting from afar noted the faint stains beneath her nails and left uneasy, his dreams haunted by visions of roots growing through rib cages. Whispers began to leak beyond the valley. Traders carried rumors to distant towns, stories of forests that swallowed the innocent, of pits where bones piled like kindling. Some dismissed them as folk tales. Others leaned closer, eyes wide with dread. The legend of the nameless dead grew until even those who had never seen the castle shivered at its mention, proof that horror travels faster than truth. The steward's conscience rotted. His hands shook as he inked each new initial, and he began hiding scraps of confession beneath floorboards. "I see them when I close my eyes." He wrote their mouths full of soil, their names stolen. He longed to speak, but fear of joining them silenced his tongue. Still, his secret parchments waited like coiled snakes ready to strike when unearthed. One stormy night, lightning split the sky and revealed the castle gates as a wagon departed. Villagers hidden in shadows watched as blood dripped from its edges, trailing into the mud. They followed at a distance, their torches hidden, until they saw the guards tip the cargo into a pit already overflowing with bodies. Mothers pressed their hands to their mouths to keep from screaming. Fathers wept in rage they could not unleash. The priest rallied the villagers in whispers, urging them to hold fast, promising that heaven saw what men ignored. Still, despair thickened, and some families fled the valley entirely, abandoning homes rather than risk their daughters' names being erased. Yet for those who stayed, every creak of a wagon wheel was a drumbeat of terror. Every silence after dusk, a reminder of who might never return. The investigator arrived at last, cloaked in rain and suspicion. He had heard the rumors at court, read letters stained with tears, and followed them to this valley where forests were cemeteries and streams ran with the scent of iron. As he crossed beneath the rusted gates, the wind howled through the trees, carrying the cries of the nameless dead, as if welcoming him into their unending vigil. The investigator was a man seasoned by war and politics, yet even he felt unease in the great hall of the castle. Tapestries of hunts and victories seemed to shift in the torchlight, their stitched eyes watching him. The Countess greeted him with false warmth, draped in black velvet, her jewels catching the flame as though mocking the dark. But beneath the perfume of roses he smelled something heavier, iron and damp earth, the scent of graves hidden under finery. He asked for the household records, masking his intent behind courteous words. The steward brought ledgers with trembling hands, their pages scarred where sheets had been torn out. The ink smears and gaps screamed louder than confessions. The investigator's gaze hardened, and though the Countess laughed sweetly and blamed clerical errors, her fingers clutched her goblet too tightly, red wine spilling like blood across her sleeve. That night he wandered the corridors with a lantern, its glow pushing shadows only far enough to remind him of their presence. Somewhere deep he heard a muffled sob, a sound cut short too abruptly. He followed the echo to a locked door bound with chains. When he pressed his ear against the wood, the silence pressed back heavy as soil on a coffin. Before he could act, footsteps approached and the steward appeared pale as wax, whispering, "Not tonight." The next morning he questioned servants one by one. Fear stitched their mouths closed, but their eyes betrayed them. One young maid broke down, whispering her sister's name before another seized her arm and dragged her away. The investigator wrote the name in his notebook, promising it would not be erased, for he understood that this was a battle not only for lives, but for memory. At supper, thunder rolled as if heaven itself passed judgment. The investigator leaned close to the Countess and asked if she feared divine wrath. Her smile cracked a tremor flickering across her lips before she recovered, claiming beauty was proof of God's blessing. Yet he saw the shadow in her gaze, the flicker of recognition that the graves in the woods were her truest mirror. The steward came to him under cover of storm, clutching a bundle of parchments bound in cloth. He laid them on the table with shaking hands, pages torn from ledgers filled with initials, ages, and cryptic symbols marking strength and youth. Tears had blurred some entries, but enough remained to condemn. "I can't carry them alone," the steward whispered, collapsing to his knees. Their cries, "Don't let me sleep." Reading the pages, the investigator felt bile rise in his throat. Each line was a life reduced to a mark, each column a monument to absence. He pressed the steward for more, and through sobs the man admitted he had seen the rituals, seen the basins filled, seen the bodies dragged to wagons and tipped into pits like garbage. His confession was the hammer blow. The investigator needed a weapon forged from guilt and ink. The following day he confronted the Countess in her own hall, unrolling the parchments so the firelight revealed their damning script. She scanned them with narrowed eyes, her face tightening as the walls of denial closed in. "Lies," she hissed, the scribbles of a coward, but her voice quivered and the silence that followed betrayed her more than words. Even her attendants averted their gaze, unwilling to defend what could not be hidden forever. News of the discovery spread like fire. Villagers gathered at the gates, torches blazing their chants of grief and fury rolling like thunder through the valley. Our daughters, our sisters. Guards shifted uneasily, some lowering their weapons, unwilling to face the eyes of neighbors whose kin they had helped bury nameless. For the first time, the fortress trembled not from storm or age, but from the weight of truth pressing against its stones. That night, soldiers forced open doors long sealed. The hinges screamed, dust choked the air, and then came the stench, thick, metallic, unholy. Within they found chains rusted into stone garments, stiff with dried blood, and basins crusted black. Deeper still, they discovered a passage leading into the forest where shallow pits yawned open, their contents revealed by rain bones stacked like kindling skulls, staring upward in mute accusation. One soldier fell to his knees, whispering, "God help us, the earth itself is full." The villagers followed the soldiers into the clearing, torches flickering against the twisted trees. Mothers dropped to their knees, clawing at the soil with bare hands, uncovering scraps of dresses and strands of hair. Fathers wept openly, their fists pounding the ground as if to wake the daughters who lay beneath. The forest, once a place of gathering wood and hunting game, became a graveyard where grief outnumbered the trees. The investigator recorded every detail, his lantern casting cruel light over the pits. He counted skulls stacked haphazardly, ribs tangled like cages, tiny bones mixed with larger ones, proof that no age had been spared. His quill shook as he wrote for. He knew these words would travel far beyond the valley. Yet no ink could capture the horror of faces erased, of families condemned to weep over nameless mounds. In the castle dungeon, more evidence surfaced, blood-stained garments, tools designed not for labor but for mutilation, ledgers hidden behind false walls. Each discovery deepened the fury of the villagers who now crowded the gates in numbers too great to ignore. They demanded justice, not in whispers, but in screams, their voices rising above the storm that battered the mountains. The Countess, dragged before them in chains, no longer gleamed with velvet or jewels. Her hair hung tangled, her lips cracked, yet her eyes burned with defiance. When accused, she spat venomous denials, claiming peasants had conspired to tarnish her name. But when bones were laid before her, carried from the forest in trembling hands, her face faltered, and the crowd surged with a roar that shook the hall. The trial was a spectacle of grief and fury. Survivors testified of sisters and daughters lured to the castle never to return. One woman described following a wagon into the woods and hearing the thud of bodies hitting soil, her words breaking into sobs that silenced even the judges. Another spoke of digging with her own hands and finding only bones she could not name. The courtroom became a chorus of mourning, each voice demanding the dead be remembered. The steward, broken and hollow, confessed publicly, recounting how he had written initials in the ledgers, how he had watched the bodies carried away like refuse. He begged forgiveness, though none came, for the mothers screamed at him, cursing his cowardice. Yet his words sealed the fate of the mistress, for they left no room for doubt. The graves in the forest were her empire's foundation. The verdict was delivered with trembling voices, but iron resolve, guilty on all counts, condemned not to public execution, but to a punishment crafted for her pride. She would be sealed alive in her own tower, walled into darkness, where no mirror would reflect her face. No admirer would whisper of her beauty, only stone and silence for companions, until death came as her final judge. On the day of her sentence, villagers filled the square, their torches blazing like judgment. Masons stacked stone upon stone as her curses echoed from the window slit, venomous and desperate. Priests raised their voices in prayer, drowning her shrieks, while children clutched their mothers' skirts, staring wide-eyed at the downfall of the woman who had haunted their lullabies. When the last stone was set, a cheer erupted not of joy but of release. The forest, however, did not forget. Even after her tower grew overgrown with ivy, the trees whispered with every wind, carrying the sorrow of those buried beneath. Travelers who camped nearby reported hearing voices at night, sobs mingled with rustling leaves, as if the nameless dead still longed for recognition. No monument marked their graves, only the silence of soil and the uneasy conscience of those who had survived. Years passed, but the legend endured. The valley remained a place where parents spoke softly of the lost, where no one dared cut wood from certain groves, where the ground seemed to bleed each time a storm split the earth. And though her body turned to dust within the tower, her story lived on as a wound carved into history. A reminder that the greatest cruelty was not merely death, but erasure, the stripping away of names until only bones and silence remained. Folklore began to weave around the nameless graves, transforming tragedy into haunting. Villagers swore that will-o'-the-wisps floated above the pits at night, pale flames dancing as if the souls of the dead sought to guide the living to their resting place. Children dared each other to step into the clearing, but most fled before reaching the first tree. their courage dissolved by the weight of unseen eyes. The priest who had chronicled each disappearance continued his vigil even after the trial. He visited the forest to pray, whispering the names he had written in his secret ledger, placing wooden crosses carved with trembling hands. Though the graves remained unmarked, his prayers carried dignity back into the silence, as if to remind heaven that these daughters were not forgotten even if the world had buried them nameless. Travelers passing through the valley wrote grim accounts in their journals. One spoke of the forest floor sinking under his boots, as if the soil still shifted with restless bones beneath. Another described how his horse reared violently, refusing to move forward near the clearing, its eyes rolling in terror at shadows no man could see. These writings spread the tale far beyond the region, ensuring the horror would never fade completely into obscurity. Artists seized upon the story, painting scenes of crimson woods and pale-faced women wandering through trees, their gowns tattered, their eyes hollow. Some works depicted the Countess herself bathing in basins, while skeletal hands reached from the ground around her. Audiences recoiled yet could not look away, the mixture of beauty and horror capturing the same fascination that had once shielded her from suspicion. Poets turned the tale into verses dripping with grief. The forest keeps what man forgets. Roots tangle hair and rain recalls the tears of mothers. Their words immortalized the nameless victims, transforming silence into song. Readers across Europe wept, horrified by a cruelty that reduced lives to anonymity, and many began to question how power could allow such darkness to fester unchecked. Historians debated fiercely. Some argued the story had been embellished, that the number of victims was exaggerated to demonize one woman. Others pointed to the bones, the ledgers, the confessions as undeniable proof that myth was only a shadow of reality. Whatever the truth, the horror lay not just in numbers, but in the anonymity of the dead, the deliberate stripping away of names, identities, and dignity. In time, reform followed. Laws tightened, and whispers of another countess were enough to launch investigations into noble households. Yet these reforms came too late for those who lay beneath the forest floor. Their legacy was not salvation, but warning carved into the conscience of Europe, like scars that could not be hidden beneath velvet and jewels. Legends claimed that storms always lingered longer above the cursed woods. Lightning struck the same barren trees again and again, thunder echoing like the cries of the nameless. Villagers avoided the area, insisting that to cut wood from those groves was to invite sorrow into one's home. Even centuries later, the land bore a reputation of unease, its silence heavier than any church bell toll. Modern excavations uncovered fragments that confirmed the stories, bones tangled together without order, rosary beads buried in mud, scraps of cloth still faintly stained. Archaeologists, hardened by years of grim finds, admitted to nightmares after their work. One confessed in his notes, "It felt as though the earth itself accused us for arriving centuries too late." And so the nameless dead achieved a kind of immortality through legend. Their bodies may have been erased, their names stripped, but their story endures, retold in every generation as a reminder of what unchecked power, silence, and obsession can do. The forest may be quiet now, its soil heavy with secrets. But when the wind howls through its branches, it still carries the voices of those who should never have been forgotten. Centuries blurred the edges of the tale, yet in the valley the grief remained sharp. Families who had once lost daughters passed their sorrow down like heirlooms, teaching children to never wander too close to the trees to whisper prayers. Whenever thunder rolled, for storms were believed to stir the cries of the nameless buried beneath the roots. The ruins of the Countess's tower stood as a scar on the hill ivy choking its stones, birds refusing to nest in its shadows. Travelers who lingered claimed to hear scratching from within the bricked chamber where she had been entombed, as if even in death she reached for escape. Whether echo of guilt or trick of wind, the sound fueled the legend that her spirit remained imprisoned forever, chained to the grave she created. Writers of Gothic novels found fertile ground in the story. Their pages described crimson-soaked woods, haunted chambers, and a noblewoman whose beauty was a mask stretched over rot. In their works, the nameless victims became ghostly figures, pale and watchful, following readers long after the book was closed. Horror fed on history, and history fed on horror, until the two became inseparable. The priest's secret ledger, discovered generations later in a monastery archive, gave names back to some of the lost. Though incomplete, its fragile pages whispered dignity into silence, listing girls once reduced to bones and anonymity. Scholars wept as they read aloud, their voices cracking on each syllable as though each name lifted a soul closer to remembrance. Villagers continued rituals of remembrance in small ways. Wreaths left at the forest's edge, candles lit on storm nights, stories retold at hearths when children begged for tales. These acts, humble yet steadfast, became resistance against erasure, a way to proclaim that the victims would not vanish again, even if their graves had no markers. Superstitions lingered stubbornly. Some said the forest paths twisted at night, leading wanderers in circles until they stumbled upon the clearing of graves. Others swore that if one called out a name into the trees, the wind would answer with weeping. Though skeptics mocked, few dared to test the stories, for even disbelief faltered in the face of silence that heavy. Historians argued over numbers, dozens, hundreds, perhaps more, but agreed that the crime was not only murder but obliteration, the deliberate denial of identity. The nameless graves stood as symbols of how power dehumanizes, how cruelty strips even the comfort of a name from the dead. This truth, undeniable, echoed across centuries as a wound that refused to heal. The investigator's writings survived too, his journal preserved in royal archives. His words described the pits in raw detail, his horror so vivid it still chills modern readers. I counted skulls until my mind broke, yet the earth offered more. It was as if the soil itself had become bone. His testimony sealed the tale not as folklore but as fact, carved into the conscience of history. Artists of later centuries painted the nameless dead as shadows stretching between trees, faceless yet accusing. In their canvases, the forest itself became alive, branches clawing like hands' roots entwined with skeletons. These works, displayed in galleries, forced audiences to confront not just the crime of one woman, but the silence of a society that had let it continue. Today, the legend endures not only as a medieval horror, but as a mirror. It warns us that the cruelty of stripping identity, of reducing lives to numbers or initials, is not confined to the past. The forest graves whisper, still asking what horrors we choose not to see in our own time, what nameless victims lie hidden beneath the soil of our silence. In the centuries that followed, storms seemed to circle the valley as if drawn by grief itself. Lightning cracked over the forest, and villagers swore they heard voices in the thunder, cries of daughters who never returned, calling out for names, for prayers, for release. The dead had no gravestones, but the sky became their restless monument. The tower of the Countess finally collapsed into ruin, yet even its rubble carried unease. Ivy wrapped its bones like a shroud, and travelers avoided sleeping nearby, claiming dreams of suffocating earth and hands clawing from the soil. The ruin was feared not as stone, but as memory, made solid, a reminder that cruelty leaves foundations stronger than mortar. Philosophers seized upon the tale, writing essays about the moral collapse of a society that allowed such horrors. They argued that the true sin was not one woman's madness, but the silence of those who obeyed, who feared speaking, who watched wagons creak into the forest without daring to follow. In their writings, the nameless graves became symbols of collective guilt. The priest's ledger, fragile and faded, circulated among scholars and clergy. Each name spoken aloud in lecture halls became an act of rebellion against the anonymity forced upon the dead. Students wept as they read them, realizing that history's statistics are built from lives that once laughed, wept, and prayed. Through these syllables, dignity was returned to bones that had lain centuries without recognition. The legend spread into theater, where playwrights staged haunting performances of daughters lured by promises of work of forests, swallowing bodies of villagers, digging in vain. Audiences sat spellbound, their gasps echoing across stages, unable to decide if they were watching fiction or a mirror of something far too real. Horror became art, but art carried truth sharper than any blade. Superstitions refused to fade. Villagers still avoided certain paths, claiming the ground shifted beneath their feet as though bones rolled beneath the soil. Others swore that if you carried a lantern through the forest at midnight, shadows would gather behind you, silent but unrelenting, until you left an offering at the clearing. Whether truth or fear, no one stayed long enough to test. Modern excavations confirmed what whispers had preserved: tangled skeletons unearthed in shallow pits, rosary beads clenched between finger bones, scraps of fabric clinging to rib cages. Archaeologists spoke in hushed tones, their gloves stained with earth that seemed reluctant to release what it had guarded for centuries. One wrote in his journal, "The ground itself resists as though it wants them to remain unnamed." Journalists retold the story with chilling photographs of bones displayed in museums, each skull a reminder that legends were built on real lives lost. Headlines screamed of the Valley of the Nameless, reigniting fascination and grief. Yet the families who lived nearby whispered that no article, no exhibit could capture the weight of the silence that pressed on the forest every dusk. In popular culture, her figure endured, depicted in films as both monster and myth, sometimes cloaked in velvet, other times as a shadow in the trees. But the victims, though faceless, remained the most haunting characters, their silence more powerful than screams. Their presence forced audiences to ask the question no legend could soothe. Who remembers the forgotten? And so the tale closes not with her tower or her jewels, but with the nameless dead beneath the trees. They are the true heart of the story, those stripped of identity, denied prayers, abandoned to rot in shallow graves. Yet in every retelling their silence breaks, their memory rises, and they whisper across centuries, "Remember us, speak our names, and never again allow cruelty to bury truth beneath the soil of silence."